Hello, my friends. I hope this evening finds you safe, warm, and resting after a long day. Have you ever seen a loyal dog panic before anyone else understood the danger, as if heaven had whispered the truth into its heart first? Tonight's story begins on a bright northern lake, where a weary truck driver, a Navy SEAL in uniform, and one faithful German Shepherd were drawn into a moment that changed every life around them. What looked like a simple accident became something deeper, a test of mercy, truth, and the quiet miracles God sometimes sends through love and loyalty. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, and if stories like this speak to your heart, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. The first light of April spread over Alder's Landing like a blessing that had arrived late, but still meant well. Northern Minnesota had not fully surrendered to spring. Pale islands of old ice still floated along the shallows, and the wind off the lake carried a clean, silver cold that could slip beneath a coat and settle deep in the ribs. Yet the morning looked so bright, so polished by thaw and sunlight, that a person might have believed hardship had packed its bags and gone south. Special Agent Mara Quinn drove along the narrow lake road with both hands steady on the wheel and her mind already half inside the meeting waiting for her in Brightwater. At 30, Mara had the composed beauty of a woman who had learned to keep her storms folded small. She was tall and spare, with dark auburn hair twisted into a practical knot at the nape of her neck, clear gray eyes that missed very little, and a face made memorable not by softness, but by restraint. People often mistook her calm for coldness. It was not coldness. It was discipline, hammered into shape by years of federal work, and by one older sorrow she rarely touched, a memory of arriving too late once, and then living with the quiet echo of that lateness. She was heading to a routine interagency coordination session involving labor complaints and regional food supply contracts. Routine, she had told herself. Blessedly routine. Coming from the opposite direction, Lieutenant Silas Reed drove a rented gray SUV toward the same morning sun. Silas was 36, broad-shouldered and hard-cut, with a weathered face that looked as if wind and discipline had both laid claim to it for years. His hair was clipped short in dark sand-colored stubble, and a close beard traced his jaw in a neat line that made him seem sterner than he was. In uniform, he looked every inch the man people expected a Navy SEAL to be, controlled, capable, and built from old iron, but his eyes gave him away. They were a clear, storm-faded blue, the kind of eyes that had seen too much distance, too many departures, and had learned to speak kindly because life had already shouted enough. On the back seat stood Valco, his 5-year-old German Shepherd, sable-coated and long-limbed, with a proud black saddle over his back and a noble, wolfish face. Valco had once worked beside him in service and now lived as his retired companion, though the word retired did not fit the dog's spirit very well. He was alert without nervousness, faithful without fuss, and watched Silas with the silent gravity of a creature who had built his world around one human being and meant to guard that world as long as breath remained in him. Silas was on a lawful transfer route between postings in the Great Lakes region, driving instead of flying so Valco could stay with him. He had a reporting deadline, a paper packet on the passenger seat, and a private hope that perhaps this next assignment might be quieter than the life behind him. Not easier. Men like Silas no longer expected easy, just quieter. A few miles ahead, Daniel Mercer guided an Alder Crest haulage dump truck through the lake bend near an old service pier. Daniel was 41, large-framed but worn down, with gentle brown eyes, a square face roughened by weather, and thinning chestnut hair flattened beneath a faded company cap. His hands were those of a laboring man, broad, dry, cracked at the knuckles, permanent proof of cold mornings and heavy work. He had the apologetic manners of someone who had spent half his life making himself smaller than his burdens, so other people could breathe easier around him. Once, years ago, Daniel had been quicker to laugh. Then medical bills, missed pay, false promises, and the long illness of his little girl had sanded the shine off him. His daughter, Emmy, carried a failing heart that beat bravely but not reliably, and every choice in Daniel's life now leaned toward one purpose only: keep the insurance, keep the medicine, keep her alive long enough for help to arrive. He had been working hours no decent company should ask of a man. Extra runs had been slid onto his schedule like stones dropped into a pocket. He had told himself he could survive one more morning, one more delivery, one more prayer on tired tires. He did not feel himself slipping. He only felt the road blur softly at the edges. Then a bark tore through the bright morning, sharp, frantic, and wrong, like a crack racing across glass. For one suspended beat, Mara's heart seemed to forget its next step. The truck drifted first, almost lazily over the line. Silas saw it and moved on instinct. There was no room for anger, no time for judgment, only one hard turn of the wheel to spare a stranger from a head-on collision. The SUV shot across the shoulder, skidded over rotten-edge ice, and plunged nose first into the narrow inlet below. Water burst upward in a dark sheet. The front of the vehicle lodged against hidden pilings from the old service dock, while thicker unmelted ice caught the rear section at an angle. The cabin did not vanish beneath the lake, but it sank low enough to invite terror into every second. Silas's forehead struck the steering wheel, and the world went mercifully black. In the back, Valco slammed against the side panel, then found the fracture in the rear glass where the impact had starred and split it. He forced himself through the opening, landed hard on the ice shelf, staggered once, and turned back at once. He did not flee. He ran in circles above the trapped vehicle, barking into the cold air with such force it seemed he was trying to wake the whole county. Mara braked, grabbed the emergency hammer and rope from her trunk, and ran downhill before her mind had finished arguing with her body. The dog met her halfway, then wheeled back, showing her the exact patch of dark water beneath the broken skin of lake ice. Up close she saw a man in uniform slumped inside, pale beneath the wavering water, one shoulder twisted against a jammed door. "Stay with me," she said, though she could not know whether she spoke to the man or the dog or herself. Dropping flat along the edge, she used the hammer to widen the fractured rear opening, then fed the rope around the frame and braced herself against the half-frozen pilings. The water bit through her sleeves like teeth. Behind her, Valco barked and paced and returned and barked again, refusing to spare with every sound he made. Mara reached in far enough to seize the fabric at Silas's shoulder and collar, lifting his head above the black water pooled in the cabin while shouting for help until her voice went hoarse. By providence or timing, the local rescue crew was already close enough to hear the commotion. 2 responders came pounding down the slope with a rescue board, a stocky paramedic with a red scarf flying behind her like a battle pennant, and a sheriff's deputy barely out of his 20s whose face turned pale at the sight of the submerged vehicle. Together, with rope and leverage and the stubborn refusal to yield, they brought Silas out of the SUV and onto the frozen mud. By then, Daniel had awakened fully, horror clearing his mind more brutally than rest ever could. He climbed down from his truck and stumbled toward the scene, stumbling over his own boots, saying, "I'm sorry," before anyone had asked for words. He looked less like a criminal than like a man who had just watched his own life split open in broad daylight. When he saw the uniform on the half-conscious stranger, he went whiter still. "Is he alive?" he kept asking. "Please tell me he's alive." The deputy, frightened and eager not to fail procedure, took Daniel's shaking wrists and cuffed them at once. Daniel did not resist. He only turned once toward the lake, as if ashamed to stand upright, while another man lay fighting for breath because of him. Valco pressed close to the stretcher as the paramedics loaded Silas into the ambulance, his ears high, his dark face fixed on the still figure beneath silver blankets. Mara stood in the bright, pitiless beauty of that morning, with lake water soaking her sleeves and the taste of metal at the back of her mouth. Silas Reed was headed to the hospital in grave condition. Daniel Mercer was under arrest at the roadside. Valco would not leave the ambulance. And somewhere beneath the clear shine of that northern day, Mara felt the first cold certainty settle into place. This was not a simple accident. Brightwater Regional Hospital stood on a low rise above the lake road, all pale brick, glass doors, and fluorescent mercy. By noon the sunlight had turned thinner, the clean April brightness outside giving way to the hushed, almost sacred light of corridors where people waited for news they could not hurry. Mara Quinn sat through statements, signatures, and repeated timelines until the words themselves seemed to lose shape. Her wet sleeves had long since dried, but the cold from the lake had not fully left her bones. She moved through the hospital with the same controlled stillness she carried into every federal room. Yet inside she felt an old unease stirring, the kind that came whenever one life had slipped into another without permission. A county deputy with a boyish face and nervous shoulders, Deputy Eli Harker, handled the first incident paperwork. He was 24 at most, freckled, polite, and eager in the way young officers often were before the job taught them how often truth arrived looking untidy. He told Mara the patient had been identified through military credentials as Lieutenant Silas Reed, and that the transfer paperwork for his current route was still being verified through 2 different commands. That meant delays, and delays meant the dog had no clear handoff yet. The thought should not have mattered as much as it did. Yet it did. Silas had been moved into a monitored trauma room under the care of Dr. Helen Barlow, the senior physician on duty. A woman in her late 50s, with silver hair braided neatly over one shoulder, and the calm face of someone who had spent 3 decades meeting panic with her own steady pulse. She was broad-cheeked, soft-voiced, and built more like a farmer's daughter than a polished specialist, but her hands moved with the assurance of long service. "He's alive, which is the first gift," she told Mara, reviewing scans with a measured gaze. "Hypothermia, concussion, bruising, some aspiration risk, but he's stronger than most. Men like him often are, until they are not, so we watch carefully." Mara thanked her, then glanced through the glass to where Silas lay, under warmed blankets and wires, his face far paler than it had been beneath the morning sun. Without the clean authority of movement, he looked younger and more human, less like a legend, and more like a man who had simply run out of luck for one terrible minute. Valco had spent the first hour in a small secured room near the ambulance bay, not a kennel exactly, but close enough to offend his dignity. He paced without frenzy, ears pricked, dark nose testing the air again and again for the one scent that mattered. Up close, Mara could see details she had missed beside the lake. The elegant dark mask over his face, the amber-brown intelligence in his eyes, the scar hidden beneath the fur at one shoulder, old and faint, a remnant of some earlier chapter no one had explained. He was beautiful in the stern, unornamented way working dogs often are, all purpose and loyalty and contained force. An animal control supervisor named Trina Bell, a compact woman with cropped blonde hair and kind hands reddened by winter, explained that Valco could be held temporarily, but boarding him formally would trigger a chain of approvals because he was attached to a federal service record and the owner was medically unable to consent. "He settles when you're nearby," she added, watching the dog stop pacing the instant Mara stepped into view. "Sometimes they choose the nearest bridge back to the person they're waiting for." Mara disliked that sentence because of how true it sounded. She told herself she was only agreeing to keep the dog for a day or two, just until a military liaison arrived. She had not planned to become responsible for anything living beyond herself. By late afternoon, she crossed to the sheriff's annex to complete a supplemental statement and sat in on Daniel Mercer's preliminary questioning, partly because she had witnessed the crash and partly because no one had yet decided how much federal attention the case might deserve. Daniel looked even more exhausted indoors than he had on the roadside. Without the harsh sunlight, the hollows under his eyes were deeper, and the slump in his shoulders seemed almost painful to witness. His reflective work jacket had been bagged as evidence, leaving him in a faded thermal shirt stretched thin at the elbows. He answered questions with slow honesty, not cleverness. Yes, he had crossed the line. Yes, he believed he had blacked out for a moment. No, he had not been drinking. No, he had not tried to run. When the deputy left to retrieve a form, Daniel stared at his own hands as if they belonged to someone who had failed him. During the property inventory, Mara noticed what he carried: a folded photograph of a small girl with pale blonde curls, smiling through the gap in her front teeth from a hospital bed. Pharmacy receipts clipped together with a pediatric cardiology statement. Pay stubs with so many deductions they looked more like punishment than wages. Daniel caught her looking and seemed ashamed, not of the bills, but of being seen by them. He told her his daughter Emmy was 9, that she loved yellow crayons and lemon ice and the old swing near their apartment complex, and that he had taken every extra run he could because saying no had started to feel dangerous in ways the company never put in writing. "They don't shout," he said, voice rough with fatigue. "They just start hinting that maybe next schedule won't keep me eligible for benefits. Maybe hours get cut. Maybe somebody else gets the easier routes. And when your kid needs care, a hint can feel bigger than a threat." The elevator doors opened with a bright chiming note, and Valco stopped so suddenly on the leash that Mara felt the jolt in her wrist before she understood why. Daniel was being escorted down the security corridor for transfer paperwork. Mara had brought Valco through the side hall because Trina needed one last signature before releasing the dog to temporary care. For one suspended second, all the air in the passage seemed to wait. A lesser dog might have lunged, barked, or pulled toward the man connected to his master's suffering. Valco did none of those things. He stood still, tall and alert, ears forward, gaze locked on Daniel's face. The dog's expression changed. There was recognition in it, yes, but not hatred. Something older, something almost sorrowful. Daniel, seeing the shepherd, flinched as though he expected judgment from the only witness who mattered. Instead, Valco lowered his head a fraction, inhaled once, and turned his eyes away. Mara felt a strange ripple go through her chest. She was too disciplined to call it intuition, yet that was the nearest word. Dogs trained for service did not read legal liability, but they read fear, intention, agitation, scent, the 1,000 tiny truths a human body confessed without consent. Valco's refusal to condemn did not prove innocence. It only unsettled the neat version of the story everyone else had already begun to tell. That evening, Mara drove home with a large retired military dog in the back seat and a silence beside her that did not feel empty. Valco entered her apartment carefully, sniffing the corners, the clean wool throw on the couch, the old bookshelf, the radiator beneath the window. Then he chose a place near the front door and lay down facing it, paws crossed, as if standing watch in sleep might still somehow serve his absent master. Mara made coffee she did not need and spread Daniel's copied pay stubs across her kitchen table. The deductions were wrong in ways that scraped at her professional memory. Too many vague labels, too many disappearing hours, too much desperation tucked between numbers. Near midnight, the hospital finally called. Silas had surfaced briefly. He had not asked what had happened to him. He had not asked who was at fault. In a voice worn thin by cold and medication, he had asked only one question: "Where's my dog?" Mara told him Valco was safe. "Through the phone, doctor." Barlow said the lieutenant had closed his eyes after that, the tension draining from his face like a man allowing himself at last to remain in the world a little longer. Mara hung up and looked across the room at Valco, who had lifted his head at the sound of Silas's name. Outside, the night wind moved softly over the thawing lake. Inside, the first outlines of a harder truth were beginning to gather. Daniel Mercer did not look like a man who had aimed ruin at another human being, and whatever had pushed him to that breaking point might not have ended with the crash. The next 2 days moved with the strange rhythm that follows a calamity. Everything appeared normal on the surface, yet every hour seemed to carry a second shadow beneath it. Mara Quinn rose early, fed Valco, answered calls from Brightwater Regional, and tried to keep her thoughts arranged in straight lines, but the straight lines refused to stay put. Valco had begun to understand the shape of her apartment now. He was not a dog who begged for affection or paced in nervous circles. He carried himself with the grave composure of a retired soldier, lean and tall, with his sable coat shining in bands of black, bronze, and smoke when the morning light touched him. At 5 years old, he was still in his strength, but there was an oldness in his gaze that belonged to creatures who had learned how quickly a peaceful day could split open. He slept by the door, lifted his head at the sound of Silas's name, and ate only after Mara stepped back, as though manners were part of the vows he had made in some invisible chapel of loyalty. Mara had known animals before, but never one that seemed to be listening to the moral weather of a room. That, more than anything, unsettled her. She drove that morning to St. Brigid Children's Heart Center, where Daniel Mercer's daughter had been admitted for monitoring. The pediatric ward was warmer than the rest of the hospital, painted in soft colors meant to persuade fear into behaving itself. There she met Emmy Mercer in person. Emmy was 9 and slight as a sapling, with pale skin that showed every blue whisper of a vein beneath it, and a cloud of fine blonde hair braided loosely over one shoulder by some patient nurse. Illness had made her small, but it had not made her dim. Her eyes were wide and bright, almost startlingly blue, and when she smiled, her whole face lit with a sweetness that made the room seem bigger. There was nothing theatrical about the child. She had the simple bravery of someone too young to call herself brave. Her hospital blanket was covered in crayon drawings, and on the tray table beside her sat a paper sun cut from construction paper, decorated with crooked yellow rays. When Mara introduced herself, Emmy asked first whether the man in the lake had lived. Mara told her he had. Then the girl asked whether her father had cried. The question struck Mara harder than anything else had that morning. "He was worried," she said carefully. Emmy nodded, as though that answer matched the world she knew. She spoke of Daniel with absolute trust. He always came back, she said. He always said they were close to better days. He always smiled, even when his shoulders looked tired. On the wall behind her bed hung a picture drawn in waxy summer colors. A little girl holding a yellow ball beside a broad man in a red cap, both standing by a lake under a sun as large as a golden coin. Mara looked at it and understood that if Daniel Mercer had failed, he had failed while trying to hold together the last holy thing in his life. Back at the field office, she spread Daniel's pay stubs across a conference table and studied them against notes from an interagency labor fraud seminar she had attended earlier that winter. Numbers had a way of revealing character when people hoped they would do the opposite. These numbers told a story of erosion, deductions for uniforms, route adjustments, equipment fees, undefined reconciliation costs, and overtime entries that did not behave like honest overtime. Mara remembered a case file used in training out of Boise, Idaho, where investigators had found a pattern of shaving labor value down through technical language and bureaucratic fog. This was not the same industry and likely not the same players, but the philosophy felt identical. Take a worker already scared. Make the paycheck harder to read than a weather map. Let need do the rest. Mara did not need certainty yet. Suspicion, properly disciplined, was enough to move her forward. That afternoon, she took Valco to the county impound yard because she did not trust leaving him alone for another long stretch, and because some part of her had begun to accept that the dog noticed things she might miss. The yard lay beyond the industrial corridor under a sky gone pearl gray with incoming cloud. Rows of damaged vehicles stood in silence like the afterthoughts of bad decisions. The dump truck from the crash had been parked near the back fence, its cab mud-streaked and sorrowful, the company logo dulled by road salt and shock. Valco approached it slowly, tail low, ears forward. He did not bark. He circled once, then leaped lightly onto the running board and thrust his nose toward the space behind the driver's seat. Mara unlocked the evidence-authorized compartment with Deputy Harker standing by as witness. Eli Harker looked less boyish here than he had in the hospital. Cold wind sharpened his face, and responsibility sat on him with a new seriousness. "You really think the dog's onto something?" he asked. Mara did not answer immediately. Then Valco's claws struck the interior panel in a quick, scraping burst, sharp as flint on stone, and the sound cut through the still yard so cleanly that both humans froze before breathing again. Behind the seat, tucked beneath a stained thermal blanket and an old metal lunch tin, Mara found a stack of handwritten shift sheets, folded into quarters, and a retired route scanner that had not been listed in the electronic inventory. The paper smelled faintly of diesel and coffee. The handwriting varied between hurried block print and exhausted shorthand. But one truth rose above the mess. Daniel had been driving more runs than the official system reflected. Supplemental hauls, early pickups, late drops, and coded initials filled the margins. None of it proved a crime by itself, but it did prove concealment. Eli let out a low breath and rubbed the back of his neck the way men do when they are trying not to swear in front of decency. Mara asked him to log everything precisely. No shortcuts, no assumptions. The dog climbed down and sat beside her boot, watchful and still, as if his work there had been completed. Later at the hospital, Silas Reed was awake longer than before. He looked worn but more anchored, the bruising around his temple darkening into clearer color. Without the blankness of unconsciousness, his character returned to his face. The quiet command, the contained courtesy, the sense that he would rather carry pain himself than let it spill over anyone else. Mara brought Valco in on a temporary courtesy clearance, and the change in both of them softened the whole room. Valco pressed close but carefully, one paw against the mattress, nose resting near Silas's hand. Silas shut his eyes for a moment, not from weakness, but from relief. When he spoke, his voice was roughened but steady. He did not remember the crash in sequence. He remembered the truck drifting. He remembered choosing the lake over impact. And he remembered one strange feeling in the minutes before it happened. Valco had become alert, not aggressive, just tense in that deep, silent way trained dogs sometimes did when something was wrong long before the human eye could name it. "It didn't feel like someone coming for me," Silas said after a pause. "It felt like a man losing his grip." Mara held on to that sentence. By evening, the official letter from Aldercrest Haulage arrived through council. It was clean, brief, and cold, in the way polished language often is when it means to leave someone outside in the weather. The company expressed concern, offered cooperation within defined limits, and stated that Daniel Mercer appeared to have accepted a supplemental run outside approved dispatch authority. Therefore, pending further review, they could not confirm corporate liability or insurance coverage as applicable to the incident. Mara read it twice, then set it down with more care than anger. That was what made it worse. Anger would have at least sounded human. This was neat. This was practiced. This was a hand in a warm office pushing a tired man toward the edge and then writing that he had stepped there alone. When Mara looked up, Valco was watching her from the doorway, and for the first time since the lake, she knew with complete certainty that the crash had not ended at the water. It had only opened the door. The letter from Aldercrest Haulage stayed on Mara Quinn's desk like a piece of winter that refused to melt. It had been written in polished language, respectful on the surface, but under every careful sentence was the same cruel idea. Daniel Mercer had stepped outside the company's protection, and now he could stand in the storm alone. Mara drove to the Brightwater Industrial Corridor the next morning beneath a sky the color of brushed steel, with Valco in the back seat and a silence in the car that felt alert rather than empty. The industrial district sat at the edge of town like something built by men who believed order could replace mercy. The loading bays were clean, the signs were straight. The glass doors shone. Safety slogans hung above the entrance in bright blue letters, too cheerful to be trusted. Inside the Aldercrest Administrative Building, a receptionist with pale pink nails and a brittle smile offered coffee before offering answers. Then Mara was handed to the company's communications manager, Gavin Pike, a narrow man in his early 40s with a sharp haircut, a sand-colored beard trimmed so precisely it looked drawn on, and eyes that never quite settled on one place for long. He wore a navy suit that fit him too well for a town like Brightwater, and spoke with the smooth patience of someone who had spent years translating ugly truths into harmless phrases. Gavin explained that Aldercrest valued its workers, that the incident was deeply unfortunate, and that Daniel had, to the best of their preliminary understanding, accepted an unapproved supplemental route beyond formal dispatch authority. He said it softly, almost kindly, which made the lie feel colder. When Mara asked to review dispatch logs, overtime records, and route communication for the week surrounding the accident, Gavin's smile remained, but it thinned. He promised cooperation through proper legal channels. On the floor beyond the office glass, men in reflective jackets moved pallets with lowered heads. A woman in a hairnet and insulated apron glanced once toward Mara and then dropped her eyes so fast it looked like fear had tugged them downward. Even the foreman answered with the flat, memorized tone of people who knew they were being listened to from somewhere unseen. Mara left with copies of nothing and certainty of one thing. This place was tidy in the way frightened houses are tidy, as if disorder itself might bring punishment. By afternoon, she was back at Brightwater Regional, where Silas Reed had improved enough to sit propped against a raised bed, though the color had not fully returned to his face. He looked stronger each time she saw him, but strength in recovery had its own fragile dignity. He moved carefully, as if his body were a machine he respected but did not yet trust. The bruise along his temple had deepened to a dark crescent, and his voice, though steadier now, still carried the rasp of cold water and oxygen tubing. When Valco entered, the dog's whole bearing changed. He did not leap wildly or whine like a pet starved for attention. He crossed the room with grave purpose, placed his head against Silas's forearm, and closed his eyes for one deep second, like a knight bowing before a wounded king. Silas's hand slid into the thick fur at the back of Valco's neck, and some knot in his expression loosened. Mara watched from the chair near the window, saying nothing. After a while, Silas spoke in fragments, assembling memory the way a man pieces together broken glass without wanting to cut himself twice. He remembered the truck drifting, yes, but before that he remembered a burst of sound from the dump truck's cab when the vehicles were still a short distance apart. Something metallic and thin, not loud enough to make out whole words, yet clear enough in feeling. A voice, pressing, impatient. Like somebody was hurrying him, Silas said. Not warning him, driving him. Mara asked whether he thought the truck had come at him on purpose. Silas took a long breath and shook his head. No. It felt wrong in a different way, like the man at the wheel was already losing something before I ever saw his face. That answer sent her toward the only person inside Aldercrest who might still have enough fear left to become honest. Lena Voss did not look like a woman built for deception. She was 26, narrow-shouldered, with ash-blonde hair cut just below the chin and tucked behind one ear, as if she had a habit of trying to keep herself out of the way of larger forces. Her skin had the pale, sleepless look of someone who lived under fluorescent light and worried in silence. She handled timekeeping and payroll reconciliation for part of the Brightwater operation, and Mara found her not at the factory, but outside a laundromat 2 blocks away, where the heat from the dryer vents breathed into the cold air like tired dragons. At first, Lena denied knowing anything. Then Mara mentioned Daniel's daughter. Something changed in the young woman's face. Not courage, not yet. Shame first, then the painful beginning of courage. She confessed that Alder Crest maintained two systems. One was the official electronic record shown to auditors, insurers, and anyone with the authority to ask difficult questions. The other was an internal layer: hand adjustments, supervisor notes, unlogged weights, route extensions, meal breaks that existed on paper and nowhere else. "They don't call it falsifying," Lena said, twisting her fingers together until the knuckles whitened. "They call it correcting inefficiencies." Her laugh after that was small and joyless. She told Mara she had seen hours disappear, extra runs buried, and exhausted men scheduled past what common decency would allow, then later rewritten as voluntary deviations. Mara did not push harder in that moment. Lena was like thin ice over deep water. Step wrong, and she would vanish beneath herself. She only gave the younger woman a number and said, "If you decide to tell the truth, do it before they decide for you what truth should look like." That night, Mara's phone cracked the quiet apart with a sudden ring at 11:17, so sharp in the apartment stillness that Valco sprang to his feet before she even touched the screen. It was Lena. Her voice came in ragged bursts, almost swallowed by breath. She said she had copied part of the real route data and payroll edits onto a drive. She said there were names on it, timestamps, hidden changes. She wanted to hand it over in person, not send anything digitally. Mara told her to go somewhere public and stay in the light. There was the sound of a car door outside Lena's end of the line, then a pause, then the whisper of the young woman saying, "Oh no." The call ended. Just ended, as if a hand had closed over it. Mara was already grabbing her coat when the hospital called through on the second line. A man had arrived at the desk outside Silas's room, claiming to be a military transport liaison authorized to take temporary custody of Valco for service-related processing. His paperwork looked clean. His manner looked cleaner. But the nurse on duty had remembered Mara's name and felt uneasy enough to stall him. By the time Mara reached the hospital, the man was gone. Security footage showed a tall figure in a dark field jacket, close-cropped hair, and a face hidden too neatly beneath a cap brim. On the form he had left behind, the transfer code was almost correct. Almost. One digit was wrong, and to Mara, that wrong digit felt like a footprint in fresh snow. Early the next morning she drove to the address Lena had given her. The apartment was unlocked, stripped of small essentials, phone disconnected, laptop gone. A woman across the hall, gray-haired and wrapped in a robe covered with faded roses, said a dark SUV had idled outside for nearly an hour the night before. Mara stood in the empty room with Valco beside her and felt the shape of the case change in her hands. This was no longer a matter of one tired driver and one clever payroll trick. Someone was moving pieces. Someone was cleaning edges. And somewhere beyond the bright slogans and neat paperwork, a hidden system had decided it could take a man, a dog, a witness, and a nearly ruined family, then arrange them all into a story that protected money better than people. Mara left Lena's silent apartment with the first true chill of dread since the lake. She was no longer touching administrative rot. She was standing at the mouth of an active cover-up. By the time the week bent toward Friday, the case had stopped looking like a traffic file and begun to resemble a machine with human bones caught in its gears. Mara Quinn did not try to carry it alone. She had seen enough investigations rot under the weight of one person's pride. Instead, she pulled in the people the truth actually needed. From the Department of Labor came Isaac Rowe, a wage and hour investigator in his late 50s, thick through the shoulders, with a weather-creased face, a cropped iron-gray beard, and the unhurried patience of a man who had spent 20 years listening to workers tell him they were fine while their hands trembled on the table. Isaac had grown up in a mill town in northern Michigan, the son of a furnace mechanic who used to say that numbers could be taught to lie if enough money held the pencil. He spoke softly, dressed plainly, and had a habit of pushing his glasses higher on his nose whenever someone tried to charm him. From the U.S. Attorney's Office came Nina Vale, an assistant federal prosecutor in her mid-30s, tall and narrow, with deep brown skin, sharp cheekbones, and a mind that moved like a razor under silk. Nina's hair was braided close and pinned cleanly back, and her voice stayed level, even when other people raised theirs. Together they began rebuilding the week of the crash from fragments: dispatch records, deleted timestamps, payroll summaries, security footage, route scanner metadata, and the quiet testimonies of people who had spent too long being treated as disposable. The more they laid side by side, the clearer the pattern became. Daniel Mercer had driven that truck while dangerously overtired. That part remained true, and Mara never tried to polish it into innocence. But the fatigue had not fallen on him like weather from a neutral sky. It had been arranged. Hours had been stretched, breaks made to vanish, wait times erased, supplemental runs buried, and the threat of losing benefit eligibility used like a whispered blade against men who could not afford to resist. Daniel sat at the center of it now, not because he had built the trap, but because he was the one the trap had chosen to close around. Mara saw him again in a county interview room that afternoon. He looked more spent than before, as if shame itself had weight and someone had hung it from his shoulders. His beard had come in uneven and dark over the past few days. His eyes were ringed in bruised exhaustion, and his big hands lay flat on the metal table, as though he were afraid they might do harm simply by moving. He was not a dramatic man. Pain in him went inward. That made him harder to watch. A lawyer sent through Alder Crest had already visited. The offer was neat, polite, and almost holy in its false compassion. If Daniel signed a statement admitting he had voluntarily accepted an off-book route, driven outside approved hours, and violated mandatory rest on his own initiative, the company would consider assisting with a portion of Emmy's medical costs. Daniel did not need anyone to explain the bargain. Sign away the truth, and your child might keep her next chance at care. Refuse, and let the system grind where it pleases. "I almost signed it," he whispered, not looking at Mara. "I had the pen in my hand. I kept thinking of her in that room with the yellow blanket." He swallowed and pressed his thumb hard against the side of his finger until the skin blanched. "Tell me that doesn't make me weak." Mara did not answer at once. Some questions deserve a full silence before the truth is placed inside them. "It makes you a father," she said at last. "That's not the same thing." At the hospital, Silas Reed had progressed from survival into recovery, though both still demanded their due from him. He could sit up longer now, walk a few steps with help, and tolerate the daylight without closing his eyes against it. There was color back in his face, though not yet warmth, and the bruise near his temple had faded into old storm colors. Valco stayed close whenever he was allowed in, lying with his head near the bed frame, as if guarding not the body of his master, but the fragile border between despair and return. Silas listened while Mara explained what the company had tried to do to Daniel. He turned the idea over slowly, like a man testing the weight of a blade before deciding whether it deserved respect. "A decent man can break," he said finally, his voice still rough but no longer uncertain. "That does not make the people who broke him decent." He looked down at Valco then, and the dog lifted his eyes, steady and grave. "He knew it before we did," Silas added. "At the hall, with Mercer, Valco saw no hate in him." Mara hadn't told him that reaction in detail. The fact that he had guessed it from the dog's altered calm unsettled and comforted her at once. The church bell rang out over the lake just as dusk turned the stained glass windows blue, and the sudden note seemed to split the evening open for one stunned, breathing moment. The bell came from Street. Anne of the Water, a small lakeside church half hidden by birch and pine, where Lena Voss had finally been found. Not captured, found. Father Paul Tolan, the parish priest, had called Nina Vale after recognizing Lena from a local payroll seminar years earlier. Father Paul was a broad, stooped man with a white fringe of hair around a weather-browned scalp and eyes the color of faded denim. His hands were farmer's hands, square and scarred, and his kindness had the firm grain of old wood. Lena had come to him in fright, carrying a tote bag and a sleepless face, asking only for one night behind a locked door. Now she sat in a side office beside a space heater, knees pulled close, her ash-blonde hair unwashed and tucked into the collar of an oversized cardigan. She looked younger than before and far more frightened, but something inside her had hardened into decision. From the tote bag she removed a slim external drive and a stack of printed adjustment reports. Isaac Rowe handled the drive with the care some men reserve for holy relics. Once the data team opened it, the hidden shape of Alder Crest's arrangement stepped into the light. Daniel had indeed been assigned the crash morning route after nearing the upper edge of safe driving hours. Several loading delays had been scrubbed from the record to make the run appear compliant. There were notes authorizing vehicle substitutions at the last minute. There were payroll edits tied to unidentified supervisor credentials. And there was a list, God help them, there was a list, of workers who had previously been pressured to sign driver fault acknowledgments after unsafe schedules or equipment problems had led to incidents the company could not easily explain. Daniel Mercer was only one name among many. The deeper shock came from a forensic note attached to the vehicle logs. The dump truck Daniel drove that morning had been swapped into service late, outside normal assignment sequence, and flagged with a hydraulic maintenance marker, different from the truck originally slated for him. The odd oil scent Valco had carried back on his tactical collar and harness had not been meaningless after all. It was one more thread, and now it ran straight into the hidden fabric of the whole scheme. When Mara returned to the county building that night, Daniel was still in holding, still one signature away from surrendering himself to save his daughter. She stood outside the room for a moment before going in, feeling the case settle into its truer shape. She had Lena alive. She had the real logs. She had proof that Alder Crest had pressed Daniel beyond safe limits and then begun building the lie that would bury him. Daniel looked up when she entered, and for the first time since the crash, something like uncertain hope moved across his face. The pen still lay on the table. He had not used it, not yet. Morning came to Alder's Landing with the kind of northern light that could make even old grief look clean from a distance. The ice on the lake had thinned to pale shards along the shallows, and the water beyond them shone like blue steel, slowly remembering how to soften. Mara Quinn stood outside the Brightwater Federal Annex with a paper cup of coffee gone lukewarm in her hand and watched the first vans roll in. She had slept very little, yet there was no heaviness in her this time, only focus. At 30, she still looked as she always had, tall, spare, self-contained, dark auburn hair pulled back, gray eyes calm enough to make careless men speak too freely. But something inside her had shifted since the morning by the lake. The case had begun as a collision of metal and bad luck. Now it stood revealed as something colder, a long chain of tidy decisions made by people in warm offices who had learned how to hide cruelty inside procedure. Isaac Rowe and Nina Vale moved beside her with the sober purpose of people who knew they were not coming to make noise, but to open locked drawers and let sunlight do its work. Search teams spread through Alder Crest's dispatch rooms, payroll offices, storage servers, and fleet yard. Employees stood in little stunned knots beneath the bright safety banners while federal agents carried out boxes, hard drives, handwritten route sheets, and internal adjustment logs that never should have existed. Mara watched faces as much as evidence. Some were frightened. Some were blank with the fatigue of those who had expected this day for years, but no longer believed it would arrive. Others looked relieved in a way almost too private to witness. A middle-aged packing line worker named Rosa Mendez, short and broad-hipped with silver beginning at her temples and strong flour-dusted hands, stepped forward first. She had the tired dignity of a woman who had raised children and carried double shifts, and learned that the world rarely thanked either effort. Her voice shook, but only once. Then others followed. A forklift driver with a limp, a scheduler who admitted wait times had been shaved down by order, a widow from sanitation whose benefits had been threatened after she asked why her overtime never matched her hours. They did not speak in grand language. They spoke in grocery math, clinic appointments, worn uniforms, and the old fear of one missed paycheck becoming a family disaster. That ordinary truth was what made it feel sacred. Daniel Mercer was not in handcuffs that morning, but neither was he free of consequence. He sat in a legal interview room under supervised release conditions, shoulders bent, hands linked so tightly that the joints looked carved from chalk. He had not signed the company's statement. The pen had remained on the table, untouched, after Mara brought him the truth. Still, the weight of what had happened lived plainly in him. His beard had grown fuller and darker across his jaw, untidy in a way that made him seem older than his 41 years. His brown eyes, gentle by nature, had the hollowed look of a man who had stood too long in the doorway of losing everything. Mara sat across from him while Nina explained, carefully and without false comfort, that Daniel would still face the legal consequences of driving while unfit. The law could not simply look away because his suffering had been real. But now there was a record, clear, documented, undeniable, that Alder Crest had driven him toward collapse through unlawful scheduling, erased wait times, hidden runs, and coercive pressure tied to his family's medical security. Daniel listened with his head bowed, as if each sentence loosened some invisible chain while fastening another, more honest one in its place. When Mara told him the company could no longer pretend he had wandered into that route on his own, he covered his face with one hand and breathed in sharply. She thought for one frightened second he might break. Instead, he sat very still and whispered, "Then Emmy won't have to hear that I chose this." In the hospital, Emmy had already heard more than a child should. Yet the little girl met the news with the same strange, bright steadiness she had shown from the start. Her cheeks were still pale, her body still small in the rolling bed, but when Mara visited that afternoon, Emmy listened with solemn eyes and asked only whether her father would be allowed to see the lake again when things were better. It was the kind of question only children and the deeply faithful know how to ask, one that assumes healing belongs in the future even before proof arrives. The discharge elevator doors slid open with a soft silver hush, and Valco rose so fast beside Mara that his tags struck together like a tiny bell in a chapel. Silas Reed stepped out slowly, one hand on the rail for balance, shoulders not yet fully even beneath his plain, dark jacket. He had been given civilian clothes for the trip home from the hospital, but nothing could hide the disciplined shape of him. The broad chest, the lean strength, the weathered face made sterner by a close beard and softened only by those storm-faded blue eyes. The lake had taken some color from him, yet it had returned something too. He no longer looked like a man suspended between two worlds. He looked like a man who had chosen one. Valco crossed the polished floor without lunging, without whining, without any of the easy drama lesser bonds might have produced. He went straight to Silas, pressed his body against his master's leg, and stood there trembling very slightly, like a rope held taut for days, finally allowed to slacken. Silas dropped one careful hand into the thick sable fur at Valco's neck and closed his eyes. Mara looked away for a moment out of courtesy, because some reunions deserve privacy, even when they happen in public. When Silas finally lifted his gaze to her, gratitude passed through his face with the quiet force of something earned rather than spoken. He thanked her simply, which was more moving than any long speech could have been. Then, true to the man he was, he asked about Daniel before asking about himself. Mara told him the truth. Daniel would answer for the harm he had caused, but he would no longer carry the lie alone. Silas nodded once. "That's the only kind of justice worth building," he said. A few weeks later, after court filings, emergency labor protections, and temporary support orders had begun to settle the first layer of chaos. They all found themselves again near the lake where the story had begun. The sky was gentler now. The shore had turned soft with new grass. Daniel came with Emmy, who wore a yellow cardigan over her thin shoulders and moved carefully but with more color in her face than before. Silas walked beside Valco at an easy pace, still healing, still careful, but upright. Mara stood near the old wooden pier, the wind lifting loose strands of hair around her temples. No one tried to make the moment larger than it was. There were no speeches, no grand declarations, only a kind of quiet the heart recognizes when something long buried has finally been returned to the surface. Then Valco stepped away from Silas and went to Daniel. The big shepherd lowered his head, sniffed the man's work-worn hand, and stood still. He did not offer absolution. He offered something rarer: recognition. He had known from the beginning what the others needed time and evidence to learn, that Daniel Mercer was not a cruel man. He was a tired one, a frightened one, a good father bent nearly past endurance by a system that counted profit more carefully than breath. Mara looked at the bright water, at the man she had pulled from the lake, at the father who had nearly been buried under another man's paperwork, and at the dog who had first called her toward the truth. She understood then that not every case begins with malice in plain sight. Sometimes it begins with a single bark over thawing water and the courage to listen long enough for the hidden story beneath it to rise. At the end of this story, one truth remains clear. A life can change in a single moment, but so can a heart. A tired father, a wounded soldier, a faithful dog, and one woman who chose to stop and listen all became part of something greater than themselves. What looked like an ordinary accident became a mirror, showing how easily people can be crushed when no one sees their pain, and how powerful grace can be when even one person decides to care. This story reminds us that not every broken person is a bad person. Sometimes the soul standing closest to disaster is simply the one who has been carrying too much for too long. That is why kindness matters. That is why mercy matters. That is why we must look deeper before we judge. In daily life, we may never pull someone from an icy lake, but we can still save a life in quieter ways. We can speak gently to the weary cashier. We can notice the coworker who seems burdened. We can help the neighbor who is struggling in silence. We can choose truth when lies are easier. And we can remember that behind many tired faces is a battle no one else can see. This story also reminds us to love animals with greater tenderness and respect. Valco did not speak, yet he told the truth with loyalty, courage, and a heart that refused to abandon the one he loved. Animals often carry a purity that humbles us. They do not care about titles, wealth, or pride. They respond to fear, love, pain, and faithfulness. They stay. They wait. They forgive more than we deserve. When we care for animals, we are often caring for one of the clearest reflections of love that God places in this world. And perhaps that is part of the miracle here. Perhaps God does not always send thunder from heaven. Sometimes He sends a bark across cold water. Sometimes He sends the right person at the right moment. Sometimes He keeps a heart beating just long enough for help to arrive. Sometimes He uses the faithful, the weary, the wounded, and the humble to reveal that He has not forgotten us. What we call coincidence may sometimes be mercy wearing work clothes. So let this story stay with you when the day feels heavy. Be the person who stops. Be the person who listens. Be the person who chooses compassion over judgment. Hold your loved ones close. Be gentle with animals. Speak truth with courage. And when life feels cold, do not lose hope, because God can still bring warmth to places that seem nearly frozen. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need comfort today. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from, and tell us what part of this story stayed with you most. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss more stories of courage, grace, loyalty, and redemption. And may God bless you, keep your home in peace, strengthen your heart in troubled times, and watch over every person and every animal you love.